introduction. I think I say that a lot, but I've really been looking forward to this one all year. I really enjoy talking during the season of Advent. But the challenge with this time of year and this topic of Advent and the Christmas story and the Incarnation is that we've heard it a million times, right? Like we've heard it over and over again. Every Christmas we hear the stories, we read it in books every year, we watch all the Christmas movies every year, so it's become so familiar that I think it's lost some of its punch. And so the challenge is for all of us to try and come at it in a new way and see it with fresh eyes. And so that's just where I want to start. I want to start by just challenging you to try and enter into this time of discussion and growing in our faith together with fresh eyes, to push aside all that we already know about the Incarnation and this topic. And so I'm going to start our time together today by telling you a story. I really enjoy stories, so I thought it would be a great place for us to start. So, once upon a time, as all great stories start, once upon a time there was a very rich but unhappy king. Unhappy because he was all alone in an empty palace. How he longed for a wife with whom he could share his life. Then one day, the king saw the most beautiful woman he had ever seen riding through the streets. Inquiries revealed that she was a peasant girl, but the king's heart was captivated. He would make sure that every day he rode past her house in the hopes of catching a glimpse of his love. But the king had a problem. How could he win her love in return? He thought he could draw up a royal decree commanding her to become his queen. But then he could never be sure that he had won her love, for she would be forced to obey a royal decree. Perhaps he could call on her and try to win her over, appear in all his regal glory and sweep her off her feet. But then he could never be sure whether she had married him or only for his powers and his riches. Finally, he came up with the perfect plan. He would come to her as a peasant. That was the only way that he could truly win her love. So he abandoned his palace and his riches and his comfort and put on the clothes of a peasant. He went and he lived among the peasants. He worked with them, shared their sufferings, danced at their feasts, until finally he won the heart of the woman who had captured his. So it is with God. Christ became one of us, lived among us, worked among us, suffered with us, danced with us, all in order to win our hearts. The end. So, I'm going to send you on the heels of that story into your first discussion. I hope you guys had a good opening discussion. Got to know each other a little bit at the table. Lots of giggling over here. I don't know what's going on. All right. Okay, so the Incarnation, that's what we're going to be talking about today, the Incarnation. When we look at the Bible, right, like we did back in September, that was our very first topic we covered. When you look at a Bible, it's divided into two major sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And what divides those two halves is the birth of Jesus, right? Because everything in the Old Testament is what happened before Jesus, and the New Testament is things that happened after. When we look at history, right? When we think about time, if we look at a timeline, it's divided into BC and AD, and what divides it is the birth of Jesus. Jesus literally divides history. You know, the fact that this is 2018 comes off of the fact that of Jesus' birth, of the Incarnation. Everything is based around the Incarnation. Jesus, who is God, coming to earth as man. This crazy idea that Jesus, who's God, came to earth as man. Every time we go to church and we recite the Nicene Creed, there's a line that we are instructed to bow our heads. And that line is when we say, "And by the Holy Spirit was incarnate of the Virgin Mary and became man." And it struck me before that is not necessarily the most dramatic thing we say in the Nicene Creed, right? We talk about Jesus' death. We talk about his resurrection from the dead. We talk about the resurrection of our bodies, the forgiveness of sins. There's all these incredible phrases But that line is the point that we bow our heads, because the Incarnation is the cornerstone of our faith. That Jesus, who is God, came to earth as man. However, the division of the Bible and the division of history this way sort of implies this idea that Jesus wasn't always around, right? That he wasn't always around. There was a time before Jesus. He came a little late to the game because there was already a bunch of stuff going on, you know? And what I want to propose to you today and talk about today is the idea that Jesus was always around, first of all, that he was always present, but then even more than that, that Jesus, and specifically the Incarnation, Jesus coming to earth as man, that was always the plan. That it wasn't an afterthought, you know, that a bunch of things were happening and then God was like, I have an idea. But that the entire story of mankind and the entire story of the Bible, that all of that was leading to Jesus, to the idea of, you know, the one who is coming, that Jesus was always the plan. Because the truth is that if we're not looking at the entire story through the lens of Jesus, we're sort of missing the point. And so today we're going to be looking at evidence for the fact that Jesus was always around, and that him coming to earth in the Incarnation, that was always the plan. We're going to look at what evidence there is for that, and then we're going to ask ourselves why. You know, why was the Incarnation the plan of God? And so we're going to start our examination into the Incarnation as the plan of God in the Old Testament. And so when we look to the Old Testament, the Incarnation was always the plan. When we look to the Old Testament, we find two different pieces of evidence that Jesus was always the plan. And so the first is images of Jesus. Images of Jesus we find in the Old Testament. And what these are things that we recognize as an image of Jesus, knowing what we know now. So we know the end of the story, and so now we look back in the Old Testament and we see a reflection of what is to come. But then the second piece of evidence for Jesus that we can find in the Old Testament are messianic prophecies. So these are words that were spoken way before Jesus directly about him. And so we're going to dive a little deeper into each of these two types and learn what the Old Testament has to say about Jesus. And we're going to start with these images of Jesus. And there's honestly so many of them in the Old Testament, but we're just going to focus in on three. And the first one that we're going to look at is Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac. And so just to get us all on the same page, Abraham and God had a covenant. God made a covenant with Abraham, and he told him that his descendants were going to be as numerous as the stars, which sounds great. But Abraham and his wife Sarah were very old, and Sarah was believed to be barren because they had never had children. And to this man, God promises he's going to have descendants as numerous as the stars. And as amazing as that promise was, and it's quite a long story, but Abraham and Sarah struggled to believe, and they tried to take matters into their own hands, and Abraham had a child with Sarah's handmaiden, and lots that goes on. But ultimately, God fulfills his promise, and Abraham and Sarah, his older wife, who they thought was barren, gives birth to his only son, Isaac. And, you know, this beautiful promise is fulfilled. But then, once again, we jump forward a little bit, and God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Something that I'm always like, I don't know how you would do that. I don't even have kids. And Abraham agrees, and in that, there's this willingness in Abraham to sacrifice his only son, and boom, you know, we see an image of Jesus, and we're transported to the cross, and we see how God surrendered his only son. Knowing what we know now, we look back and we see Jesus in that. Another example is in the person of Joseph. So again, long story here, but just to summarize a bit, Joseph had a bunch of brothers who did not like him very much. And so they plotted first to kill him, but then decided, oh no, we'll just sell him into slavery. And so Joseph becomes a slave and goes through a whole mess of things, but God is always with him. God is with him in the good and the bad. But ultimately, after a very long journey, he rises to a position of power in the new land in Egypt. And his brother's land goes into a time of famine. And so they need to come to Joseph and beg for food, but they don't even recognize him. And so, again, long story short, ultimately there's this beautiful reunion, and Joseph says this. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And I hear that, and knowing what I know now, I think of Jesus, and how when he was killed, people intended to harm him, right? But God intended it for good, for the saving of many lives. And we see an image of Jesus in the Old Testament. The final one I want to leave you with is David, the person of David, specifically in the story of David and Goliath. So Goliath, as we know, he was this sort of super soldier who was terrorizing the Israelites. And the Israelites needed someone who could defeat this huge man. And so they're thinking, okay, we need, a war hero. We need an expert soldier. And ultimately, the one who defeats him is a young, lowly shepherd. Not what you would expect. And in the same way, we know that the people of Israel, they were expecting a Messiah, but they were expecting a conqueror, right? Someone who was going to come in and conquer, and instead they got a carpenter. And it was a lowly carpenter who would be their salvation, not what they were expecting. And boom, we have an image of Jesus. And again, there's so many of these all throughout the Old Testament. It's so cool to find them as you read. But here we see these images of Jesus that show us that he was always coming. The Incarnation was always the plan. The second type of evidence in the Old Testament that I mentioned are the messianic prophecies, the specific words that were spoken about Jesus before he was around. And the very first messianic prophecy, promise of a Messiah in the Old Testament, is in the very first book of the Bible, in Genesis. It's early on. So we see that from the very beginning, there was this promise of a Savior who was coming. And so this passage was actually in the readings for today, for the Immaculate Conception. But to give a little backstory, so what's just happened is Adam and Eve were in the garden, and they ate the fruit they weren't supposed to, and so God has been, doling out his punishments and condemning them for what they have done. And here he's specifically talking to Eve and to the devil, that was that serpent who led them astray. And he says this, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Now, this verse is special. It's called the Protevangelium. And it's this first promise of a Messiah, because it's believed that Eve's offspring that is referred to, the seed of Eve, is referring to Jesus, the one who will crush Satan, ultimately defeat him, which Jesus did when he died on the cross. And so there's this very first promise of that coming salvation. But then the Old Testament continues, and in the book of Isaiah specifically, we find a lot of messianic prophecies, but I'm going to focus in on one that's especially relevant this time of year. And it says this, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." This one just blows my mind when I don't think about it as a routine, right? That years and years and years before Jesus, someone was like, hey, a virgin is going to give birth to a son. That is crazy, right? That is absolutely crazy, and yet that is what we know would happen. It's a beautiful messianic prophecy that we see fulfilled at Christmas time. Another we're going to look at, sort of moving toward Jesus' passion, is in Zachariah. And it says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey." And we know that on Palm Sunday, Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey. How specific, how random. But these prophecies are all throughout the Old Testament. Words that Jesus specifically fulfilled during his time on earth. Even in things he couldn't control, like his birth. So in all these things, we find evidence for the fact that, Jesus was always the plan, that he was spoken of long before his birth, marked history and marked the Bible. And actually, we're going to turn to the New Testament because we can find evidence in the New Testament. Specifically, we're going to look at the prologue of John's Gospel. And again, we find evidence that Jesus was always around, right? That he didn't come later. So we're going to turn to the very beginning, the first few verses of John's Gospel. And it says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So first I have to pause and point out that this is where we got our title for this month from. Our title this month is "The Light Shines," and so we pulled it from this part of the prologue of John's Gospel. But I also just want to stop and point out how straightforward this is. If someone was like, how do we know that Jesus was around before his birth? Because it says it very clearly, right? In the beginning was the Word. And so now we're going to sort of dive in and try to piece this apart piece by piece and get a little more from it. The very first words that we find here, the first words of John's Gospel, "in the beginning," those are also the first words of the Bible. That's how Genesis begins, in the beginning. And so we trust that the author knew that and was making this direct connection. He was comparing, Jesus' coming with the creation of the world. But more than that, we see that it's directly implied that Jesus was there at the start of it all, in the beginning, when the heavens and the earth were created. Jesus was there. This word, it seems like an odd choice to be talking about Jesus, right? This word. If we were going to reverse translate that, the word is logos. Logos is where we've translated that to be word. And logos is an interesting word because in the Old Testament, logos is used as to mean God's manifestation, things that reveal God. And when we understand that, it makes so much sense because we know that Jesus is the complete and whole revelation of who God is. And so it's such an interesting choice that John used in his gospel. It's a little odd. It takes us a second to get used to, but he was saying that Jesus is the revelation of who God is. And so we have this idea of word. So we look at this person, this word, and it says, okay, he was in the beginning. He has been since the beginning of time. And then it says, and the Word was with God. And so here we see that there's a distinction between the Word and God. There's this distinction in the Godhead. But then it continues to say, and the Word was God. And so here we find the idea that Jesus is divine, but that he is not all of divinity. There's some really big theological statements being made just in the beginning of this. And it goes on to talk about how through him all things were made, and it repeats it a couple of times. But again, it's just driving this idea that Jesus has always existed, that at the creation, at the very beginning, Jesus was already there. And we're going to jump a little further down in this prologue of John's Gospel and look at John's version of the Incarnation. Because John is the only gospel that actually doesn't have a birth narrative. There's no mention of the virgin birth of Mary in the birth context in this gospel. There's one line. That is John's version of the Christmas story. But in some ways, that one line makes grander claims than the virgin birth narrative does. And the line says this: "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." The Word became flesh. And what's so interesting about the author's use of that word flesh is that if you dive into the New Testament, the word flesh is really used in a negative way. Flesh typically means like everything that's broken about humankind, like all of the things that are wrong with us. That's our flesh, right? Like the desires of the flesh, it's typically referred to as a bad thing. And the flesh can also mean all the things that are wrong with the world, sort of. And I think that that was such a deliberate choice, because it's not just saying, hey, Jesus became man, but it's saying Jesus became flesh, and he took on all the brokenness that comes with that. All the bad things about being human, all the bad things about being in this world, Jesus became. And I love that, because there's so much about the incarnation that leads me to feel like Jesus gets how hard this life can be, how hard it can be to be a human. And then it continues to say he made his dwelling among us. And the reason there's a picture of a tent up there is because a more literal translation of that is he pitched his tent among us. He pitched his tent among us, which is a very sort of graphic, like earthy way to talk about the incarnation. And when I was in college, studying ministry, among other things, when we were talking about youth ministry, my professor always used to point to this verse and this idea of he pitched his tent among us. And he would say, if you want to minister to teenagers, you need to pitch your tent among them. You need to do incarnational ministry. And what that meant was, I can't stay in my world and try to minister to teenagers. I need to go where they are. I need to get on their level, pitch my tent among them, live among them, be with them where they are, not where I am necessarily. And that's exactly what Jesus did. That when I was learning about that, it helped me understand what Jesus did on a deeper level, that he came in right where we are. And then the final thing I just want to point out about this amazing verse on the incarnation is the fact that we see this transition of Word, Jesus being referred to as the Word, and then at the end he's referred to as the Son. And that is the last time in John's Gospel Jesus is called the Word. From that point on, he's the Son. So it's interesting. I think that's really cool. So we've looked at the Old Testament, and we've seen how there's evidence in the Old Testament that Jesus was always the plan, that he was always going to come, that the incarnation was not something God came up with later when he saw that we were messing everything up. And then we've looked at the New Testament, and we've seen evidence how in John's Gospel Jesus was always around, and then how he came and he pitched his tent among us. But now we're going to ask that question of why, right? Like, why was the incarnation the plan? And why should you care about the incarnation? What does it mean to you? And so, again, we're going to turn to this prologue of John's Gospel and read a little bit more in verses 9 through 13, where it says, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of a human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." And so that's what it means, right? The incarnation means that you and I can become a child of God. And so in preparing for this talk, I was trying to think about my experience being a child, and go back to my memories and my childhood. And I was very fortunate in that I came from a family where I had two really wonderful parents who I knew loved me unconditionally. And I was very, very blessed in that way. And so I was thinking back, and I was trying to name sort of what that experience was like. What was it about being a child in my family that was so special to me? What was it about being a child that was so incredible? And what I came up with was the fact that my family knew me, that I was known by them, and they loved me, and I want to throw like a anyway on there, right? That I was so well known, but I was still loved. You know, my family knew that I was really grumpy in the morning, which isn't as true anymore, I promise. But they knew how grumpy I could be in the morning. They knew how really stubborn I could be when I thought I was right, you know. They knew all of my weaknesses and the ways that I would let them down, that I let myself down. They knew my insecurities. They also knew the things that I was gifted at and the things that I was, you know, blessed to be able to do. They knew me really, really well, and they loved me anyway, you know? And that is such an incredible experience. And as I was thinking about that, I was reminded of this quote by Tim Keller, who's a Christian author and speaker. And he says this: "To be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is what we need more than anything." And that was what I was so lucky to experience with my parents growing up. And that is what we can experience with God. A few weeks ago in the young adult Bible study here at Christ the King, we were discussing how in the Christian faith, our relationship with God is that of, you know, a parent to a child. And in other religions, it's more like a master to a servant. And we were sort of discussing the relationship dynamics between the two. And I was thinking that, you know, in a child-parent relationship, the child can have a temper tantrum, right? Like, we can yell and scream. We can ignore the parent for a little while. You can, you know, try to walk away, try to shut them out. There's all these things you can do, but the parent is still going to love you. It's still going to be there. And that's not, you know, as true. That's not true of that master-servant relationship. And we were talking about how lucky we are in this faith to have that parent-child relationship where we can get angry at God, right? We can be mad at him. We can walk away, and he still loves us. And so the incarnation, you know, matters because it gives you the ability to be a child of God. And at the end of the day, you know, you are fully known, which I think we all crave so much, right? To be known by someone. You are fully known and fully loved, anyway, by God. And I think that, you know, that is the light. You know, in John's prologue, we heard about the light that shines in the darkness. That is the light that can shine in the darkness of this world, that can bring us down. That no matter what you do, because Jesus came in the incarnation, because he's made you a child of God, you are fully known and fully loved. So, anyway, with that, I'm going to send you back